Picture this. I'm standing inside a hut so small it seems made for breath, not bodies. The walls are thin planks of pine, warped by years of wind. Frost creeps through the seams like cautious fingers. The fire in the corner stutters, gasping for air as if it, too, is afraid to die. And in the center of it all, a woman kneels. Her hands are steady but trembling from exhaustion. She presses a glowing stone against her baby's chest. Not a gemstone or charm, just a lump of river rock heated until it hums with faint orange light. The child's skin, bluish at the edges, begins to color. A thin wail escapes its lips, and the mother exhales, shoulders falling. The fire answers her relief with a sigh of its own, crackling back to life. For a moment, both mother and flame remember what survival feels like. Outside, the valley stretches in silence. Snow piles on snow, erasing paths, fences, names. The wind has its own vocabulary here, sharp, repetitive, unkind. It scolds the walls and tastes for weakness. Every sound feels like the end of something. I've seen places like this before. Not just in stories, but in the corners of the world that history forgets to update. Every civilization begins somewhere like this, cold, hungry, afraid of the night. This hut, this mother, this trembling fire. They're our first architects. Now, picture another world. Far to the south, sunlight falls on a palace carved from limestone and memory. The air hums with the low rhythm of desert insects. Courtyards shimmer, marble gleams, and fountains mimic eternity with every drop. In that brightness walks a queen. Barefoot, calm, her feet remember the heat of the earth beneath the polished stone. Servants scatter petals in her path, but her eyes are elsewhere, fixed on the horizon where the sun swells like a living god. Her world is ruled not by frost but by fire. And yet, the two women, the mother in the hut and the queen in her palace, are bound by a single, secret dependence: warmth. One guards it as if it might flee. The other believes she commands it. But warmth, as I would come to learn, answers only to balance. These worlds should never have met. And yet, in some impossible symmetry, their survival depends on the same law. What you give returns, what you hoard decays. That is where I begin my story, on the edge of two extremes, tracing the invisible thread that ties a mother's hearth to a queen's sun-drenched throne. Tonight, I invite you to walk that thread with me. From the ashes of northern villages to the golden dust of forgotten kingdoms. From the language of breath to the politics of fire. I have spent years chasing this secret, through archives, ruins, and dreams that refuse to fade. Sometimes I think it was never a secret at all, only something we stopped listening to. The old people of Valmir would have called it the breath of the world. The scholars of Setham would have called it energy. But to both, it meant the same thing: the quiet transaction that keeps life possible. You can hear it even now, if you listen. The hum of the radiator beside you. The whisper of an unseen current flowing through the wires that feed your screen. The pulse under your skin, warm and constant, asking nothing in return. Two worlds, one ruled by frost, the other by fire. Both trying to remember how to stay alive. And somewhere between them, between the woman who guards the ember and the queen who walks through flame, there lies a truth that once bound civilizations together. That truth was almost lost, until someone, centuries ago, wrote it down in two languages and buried it in the sand. I found traces of it in their stories, in the ash of burned libraries, in the breath between myth and science. So, if you're ready, dim the lights. Let your room fall quiet. You and I are about to travel a long way through time. From the frozen silence of Valmir to the golden air of Setham. From the faith of peasants to the philosophies of queens. We're not searching for heroes. Only patterns, not miracles. Mechanisms, not villains. Systems. Because every empire, no matter how vast or holy, begins with a single act of warmth. Someone choosing to keep another alive through the night. And that, traveler, is where the secret world of queens and servants begins. Good evening, traveler. Before we go any further, let's breathe together. In through the nose, out through the heart. The old rhythm that has carried warmth across centuries. I don't know where you are listening from. Maybe a city apartment where traffic hums like a restless tide. Maybe a farmhouse where wind presses against the windows like a polite but persistent guest. Perhaps you're somewhere in between, your screen glowing in a half-dark room, that blue light standing in for a hearth. Wherever you are, let the air settle around you. Let the noise of the day loosen its grip. Dim the lights. There's no hurry here. I've always believed that every story deserves a temperature. This one begins cool, frost gathering on the sill, the smell of wood smoke somewhere close, the kind of silence that sharpens the mind. If I could hand you something now, it would be a cup of whatever keeps you steady: tea, wine, water, memory. Something warm enough to remind you that you're alive. Imagine the sound of an old hearth. Not the dramatic crackle of a bonfire, but the gentle murmur of fire negotiating with wood. You can hear it breathe if you listen long enough. A soft inhale as it draws in air, a sigh as it exhales sparks. The scent is a mixture of earth and smoke, like rain remembering it was once snow. That's where I want to begin, not in the halls of kings or libraries of gold, but right here, by the kind of fire that needs tending. Outside, the world is full of noise, commerce, politics, ambition, all those things that burn hot and fast. But here, in the quiet, the pace changes. The warmth is slower, more deliberate. It invites attention. It asks you to stay. In Valmir, the people used to measure life not in years but in winters survived. They knew the cost of warmth, the labor behind every ember. A single spark could mean the difference between feast and famine, between lullaby and elegy. They spoke to their fires as if to gods, not out of superstition, but gratitude. When the flames leaned low, they whispered encouragement. When the wind howled, they listened for advice. And somewhere in that ritual, so simple it feels like breathing, was an understanding we've mostly lost. That warmth was never guaranteed. It had to be earned, protected, shared. That's why the old stories always begin with firelight and end with dawn. Every night was a negotiation with the dark. Sometimes, when I tell this story aloud, I imagine 1,000 tiny hearths scattered across time, each one a circle of people leaning close, faces lit from below. The languages change, the prayers evolve, but the sound is the same. That soft, human hum that says we are here, we are still warm. Maybe you felt it too. In a power outage when candles are the only light left. In a hospital waiting room, where strangers share coffee without speaking. In a small kindness that makes the air less cruel for a moment. That, too, is the breath law, the unspoken rule that warmth must move to survive. If you wish, you can tell me where you're listening from. I like to imagine it. A map dotted with quiet rooms, each with its own glow. Someone in Warsaw, someone in Nairobi, someone in Buenos Aires, someone here with me, all breathing in time. Across miles and centuries, warmth still connects us. Now, close your eyes for a second, if you can. Picture the firelight flickering across the walls of that northern hut. Picture the woman from before, her baby now asleep. The stone cooling slowly beside them. The wind still scratches, but it's softer now, curious rather than cruel. That's how survival often feels, not triumph, just endurance granted one more night. I think about her often. About the countless unnamed hands that learned how to keep flame alive before anyone understood oxygen or combustion. They were scientists without language for science, theologians without doctrine. They discovered thermodynamics through necessity and faith through repetition. Every spark a prayer, every ember an equation solved by instinct. It humbles me, even now, to think that all our cities, all our light, our engines, our screens, all of it, descends from that simple act. Someone refusing to let the dark win. So, traveler, before we step into history proper, take another breath. Feel the air enter your lungs, the subtle heat it brings. You are performing the oldest ritual there is. The one that made everything else possible. Because this story, beneath its queens and servants, its myths and ruins, is really about that. The shared pulse that keeps us human. The tiny, persistent fire that refuses extinction. And so, as the night deepens and the glow from your screen becomes our modern hearth, we begin, not with the noise of empire, but with the silence that came before it. The quiet where survival learned to whisper its name. Breathe in, the frost has not yet come. Breathe out, the fire waits to be remembered. That's where our story begins. Before I learned to read history in books, I learned to read it in air. The way wood smoke carries memory farther than any archive ever could. Valmir was like that. A village that wrote itself in breath. Every morning, smoke rose in quiet ribbons from 100 chimneys, carrying news of who had woken, who had fire, who still lived. I grew up believing the world ended at the ridge of our valley. Beyond that, there was only ice and the gods who owned it. We didn't call it isolation, we called it order. Our lives moved in rhythm, the slow percussion of work and weather. The frost came when it said it would. The thaw kept its promises. That was enough religion for us. I can still smell it now. Pine sap bubbling on logs, the faint sweetness of thawing earth. Our homes were humble, square, low, their roofs bent under the snow like old backs under years of duty. Smoke leaked through the seams, not because we were careless, but because we were practical. If smoke could find a way out, warmth could find a way to stay. My mother used to hum while she worked, a tune with no words that the wind seemed to understand. It was an old melody, probably older than Valmir itself. Children learned it before speech, mothers passed it on without meaning to. I think now it was a kind of code, the sound of continuity disguised as song. The village itself was small, barely 30 huts and a single stone hall that served as meeting place, sanctuary, and storage for everything that mattered. In that hall hung the symbol of our goddess Elandra, a circle carved in wood, half scorched, half polished. Warmth and cold, joined but never reconciled. When I was a boy, I thought it was a moon. Only later did I realize it was a mirror. Our elders told us that Elandra did not punish, she negotiated. She gives cold to test your sharing, they said. She gives fire to test your restraint. That was the kind of wisdom that kept us obedient but also kept us alive. Days began before the sun, because the frost always woke first. Fathers and sons cut wood until their fingers stung. Mothers stirred pots before light reached their windows. Children gathered ice from the river and stacked it beside the huts, not for storage but for prophecy. The patterns in the frozen water were said to foretell the strength of the coming winter. We read them the way city people now read forecasts on glowing screens. There was poverty, yes, but it was communal poverty. Misery shared evenly becomes endurance. No one in Valmir starved while another feasted, no one froze alone. Even the stray dogs slept in doorways, and every doorway smelled faintly of soup. We measured time differently. Years were not counted by numbers but by stories. The winter of the cracked river, the summer when the elk returned, the year Mira was born. That last one, the year of Mira, still glows in my mind. Even as a child she carried the quiet certainty of someone who knew where warmth came from and how to coax it back when it fled. But I'll speak of her soon. For now, it's enough to say she belonged to that generation of Valmir that still trusted rules. Because back then, the world had rules. Every season behaved according to a covenant older than language. The first frost arrived the week of the harvest festival. The river froze but never before we'd stored enough food. The snow covered the roofs but never so high that it silenced the chimneys. Predictability was our comfort, our wealth, our God. We sang about it, even. The old winter song, I still remember the refrain. Frost may take the field, but not the flame. Fire may dim, but not the name. The name, of course, was Elandra's, though some whispered it was simply the name for survival itself. Every child learned the rhythm of endurance. The tasks were simple but sacred. Stack the logs, feed the fire, bury the embers at night so they'd wake again by dawn. We didn't know we were performing physics. We thought we were performing gratitude. Visitors were rare. Maybe a pair of traders passing through on their way to southern markets, wrapped in furs, their voices thick with the accents of places that had more colors in their sunsets. They told stories of cities so warm that people slept under nothing but the sky, of markets where spices perfumed the air. We laughed, polite but unbelieving. Warmth like that sounded dangerous, indulgent, almost sinful. Even in hardship, Valmir was generous. A traveler could knock on any door and be given soup and a place by the fire. It wasn't hospitality, it was arithmetic. Every added body meant more warmth shared between fewer flames. We understood community not as kindness but as efficiency. That's what I loved about my people, their blunt intelligence, their lack of sentimentality. They knew life was a contract signed in heat and breath. Keep it, and it keeps you. If I sound nostalgic, it's because I am. Not for the cold or the hunger, but for the certainty that the world made sense. We believed that if we did our part, if we prayed, worked, and respected the rhythm, the frost would keep its distance. But history, like weather, eventually breaks its patterns. I remember the night the rhythm faltered. It was small at first. The river froze too early, the birds left without singing. The elders frowned but said nothing. The firewood felt damp even when dry. It was as if the air itself had changed its mind about mercy. Looking back, I realized that was the moment the old covenant ended. The moment warmth stopped being a right and became a question. They thought they understood the world. We all did. Until the night the rules changed. That winter came too soon. Not a slow arrival, but a collapse, like a door slammed by an unseen hand. One week we were harvesting the last of the root crops, the next, the fields were armor. The soil turned to iron under our boots, the air to glass in our lungs. The river, our clock and confidant, froze mid-sentence. It made no sound. At first, the elders called it a warning. Elandra is impatient this year, they said, half joking. We believed them because we wanted to. It was easier to think of gods growing restless than of nature forgetting its promises. The harvest could be lost, we told ourselves, but not the rhythm. Never the rhythm. But the rhythm never returned. The frost didn't stop at the fields. It crept inward, slipping through the smallest gaps in the walls, tracing pale veins along the inside of windows. It was beautiful in the cruel way that death often is. The patterns looked like feathers or wings. Some said it was Elandra herself, descending to take stock of her believers. I remember the first night our fire refused to rise. My father struck flint until his hands bled, sparks dancing in defiance but never catching. My mother's breath fogged the air between us. I could hear her whispering to the wood as though coaxing a frightened child. Finally, she pressed her palms together and murmured, in through the nose, out through the heart. She breathed onto the kindling, slow and steady, the old way. A tiny flame answered her, weak but alive. She smiled without teeth, the kind of smile that's more endurance than joy. Outside, smoke from our neighbors' chimneys rose and hung low, then vanished. Within days, it stopped altogether. No smoke meant no heat, no life. I'd watch the horizon and count how many columns of gray still reached the sky, a morbid census of survival. Each day there were fewer. People adapted at first, as people always do when denial still seems possible. Families moved into shared huts, pressing bodies together under wool blankets until the air itself grew human again. The nights were long symphonies of coughing, prayers, and quiet sobbing muffled by mittens. Food spoiled quickly. The cold didn't preserve it as we'd hoped. It froze the fat solid, cracked the barrels, split the grain sacks. The frost was not ordinary, it bit from the inside out. There was a night when even the animals went silent. No crows, no dogs, not even the low breathing of cattle in their stalls. The whole valley seemed to hold its breath. I remember stepping outside, the sky so clear it looked sharpened, every star a pinprick wound. The snow gleamed blue, too blue, as though it reflected light from somewhere not of this world. Then came the quietest calamity of all. The fires began to die. Not just weaken, die. One by one, hearths went cold, even the ones that had burned all day. We'd wake to find ashes pale and lifeless, not even warm to the touch. It was as if the frost had learned our trick of burying embers and had decided to bury them better. Desperation makes believers of everyone. We prayed to Elandra in new ways, invented hymns she had never asked for. Some offered their blood to the hearth, others placed coins, herbs, even locks of hair. Nothing answered. Then the stranger came. It was late, so late that the stars had begun to drift westward. I remember because their light seemed closer than the moon's, and everything around our hut felt brittle, like one wrong sound could shatter the night. We were huddled together, the last of our wood nearly gone, when someone knocked. 3 taps, slow, deliberate. My father opened the door a crack. The wind rushed in first, angry to be kept waiting. Then came the man. He wore a cloak so heavy with frost it looked carved from the storm itself. His face was shadowed, but his eyes, God's, his eyes, glowed like the coals of a dying fire, orange shot through with blue. He didn't speak. He simply stepped forward, leaving behind footprints that steamed. In his hand was a small pouch. He opened it and poured a pinch of shimmering dust into his palm. It glowed faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. Without a word, he scattered it over our hearth. For a heartbeat, nothing, then light. Not ordinary firelight, but something purer, more alive. The flame rose high, a column of blue and gold that filled the room with impossible warmth. My mother cried out, not in fear, but gratitude. My father sank to his knees. I just watched, unable to breathe, certain that this was either miracle or madness. The stranger stepped back. The fire steadied, its color fading to a rich amber, humming softly as if alive. He turned toward the door, and that's when I noticed. Where he walked, frost melted. The air bent around him, blurred by heat. "Who are you?" my father managed to ask. The man paused, his face hidden by the hood. When he spoke, his voice was quiet and clear, neither young nor old. "I am nothing you can keep," he said. Then he stepped outside. By the time we followed, he was gone. Only his footprints remained, each one a dark patch of wet earth amid the snow. They stretched to the edge of the field, then ended abruptly, as though the frost had swallowed them whole. We called the place Elandra's Path. The snow never settled there again. Even in deep winter, that narrow line of earth stayed bare and faintly warm. By dawn, the story had spread through the valley. People came to see our hearth, to touch the ashes that no longer cooled. The flame never went out after that. Not ours, not anyone's. Somehow, every home rekindled its fire. No one could explain how. The elders said the goddess had taken pity. Others whispered that the stranger was no god, but a man who'd mastered the secret language between frost and flame. I didn't know what to believe. I only knew the frost had stopped advancing. And in the quiet that followed, I felt something new stirring under the relief, an unease I couldn't name. Because miracles, I would learn, always come with instructions we never hear. That winter ended, but the rulebook of the world had already changed. After the stranger left, the world felt lighter, but only for a season. The frost retreated, yes, but it left behind a kind of silence. The air had changed. It hummed faintly, as though the valley itself was remembering something it had almost forgotten. And we, the people of Valmir, were no longer quite sure what we'd witnessed. Miracle, magic, science, those words hadn't been invented for us yet. We only knew that our fires no longer behaved as they once had. They burned longer, brighter, cleaner. Sometimes the flames flickered blue, a color none of us had seen before. The old laws of fuel and smoke no longer applied. A single ember could outlast a night without being fed. It was a blessing, yes, but also a riddle. It was Myra's mother who first gave the mystery a name. She called it the breath, saying that warmth was alive, a creature of exchange. It needs to move, she told us, the way lungs do. If you hoard it, it dies. She began teaching people how to tend the new fire, slow breathing, patient movements, a rhythm that became ritual. In through the nose, out through the heart. That phrase spread faster than flame itself. Within a month, every child in Valmir knew it. It became a greeting, a prayer, even a lullaby. When we exhaled over coals, the fires seemed to listen. When we shared breath and song, the hearths flared as though in applause. Maybe coincidence, maybe communion, either way, it worked. And so, out of desperation, we built a system. Each household was tasked with burying its embers in ash before sleep. Not to extinguish them, but to preserve them, a womb for flame. Every morning, the oldest or youngest in the family would dig into the ash and breathe gently on the hidden ember until it woke again. If the ember failed, neighbors shared theirs. We called those who carried the warmth ashkeepers. The first of them were volunteers, ordinary families with steady hands and good memory. But before long, their task took on a sacred aura. People began bringing offerings, bread, wool, a carved spoon, tokens of gratitude for shared fire. It became a kind of social currency. You could measure a family's honor by how many embers they'd given away that winter. Myra's mother was among the most trusted of these ashkeepers. She kept a journal of heat, the first record of what we would later call the law of breath. She charted which woods burned best, how long embers lived when sealed in ash, how breathing patterns changed the color of flame. What she discovered bordered on the scientific. Fire responded to rhythm. The pattern was clear. If you blew too fast, it died. If you smothered it, it suffocated. But if you breathed steadily, in through the nose, out through the heart, it seemed to recognize you. It would bloom, sigh, and live. We began to treat flame as a partner, not a tool. Over time, the rituals deepened. The ashkeepers gathered weekly in the meeting hall to exchange embers and record their lineage. Fires were no longer personal, they were communal, all descended from the night the stranger came. People began naming their hearths. Mine was called Solvan, meaning, the stubborn one. Others chose gentler names. Whisper, Old Mother, the Watcher. To outsiders, if there had been any, it would have looked like religion. But to us, it was arithmetic. The logic of survival disguised as devotion. Each ember was a promise renewed, a breath passed along the spine of the valley. Children grew up learning the hierarchy of warmth. How to balance the household fire. How to breathe without greed, how to lend heat without losing it. Those lessons shaped our laws more than any ruler ever could. With every passing season, the ashkeepers' influence grew. They began crafting new vessels for storing embers, small clay jars lined with silver dust that glowed faintly even when sealed. These jars could hold fire for days. The keepers started trading them with nearby villages, carrying warmth across frozen rivers like merchants of survival. Our economy shifted. Gold meant nothing, ash became wealth. A single warm stone could buy grain. A jar of live embers could settle debts or end feuds. We learned to measure trust not in words but in heat shared. The keepers also codified their practices into a set of rules, our first laws that weren't born from superstition. The law of breath had 3 tenets. Fire must travel. A flame unshared is a flame that dies. Breath must guide it. The body's rhythm sustains the world's. Ash must remember. Nothing truly burns away. Everything becomes the seed of its return. We carved those words above the doorway of the meeting hall. I still see them when I close my eyes, glowing faintly in memory's light. It might sound idyllic now. This village bound together by kindness and careful breathing. But even systems born from faith have shadows. The ashkeepers became important, then essential, then powerful. The line between stewardship and authority began to blur. Soon, they were the ones deciding whose fires were renewed first when shortages struck. They kept ledgers of warmth distributed, of embers given and owed. They said it was fairness, it was bookkeeping. But fairness has a way of turning into hierarchy when measured too long. Still, for many years, it worked. The winters grew milder, or maybe we just grew wiser. The valley flourished. Children were born who had never seen frostbite. We began to forget that our miracle had come from a stranger's hand. By the time I reached adulthood, the rituals were as ordinary as breathing. No one questioned them. It was the way things had always been. That's the trick of survival. If it lasts long enough, it becomes tradition. Looking back now, I can see how fragile it all was. This balance of warmth and worship, generosity and control. Systems that save us often learn to rule us. But I didn't know that then. None of us did. We thought we had mastered the frost. We thought our faith had made us invincible. And in the quiet between one winter and the next, when the snow melted early and the river sang louder than usual, a child named Mira stood by her mother's hearth and whispered a new prayer into the embers. That whisper would change everything. I remember Myra's mother before she became a legend. Her name was Irena, though no one called her that. To us she was simply the keeper. She had the kind of face that made the wind hesitate, stern, patient, always listening for what the air might say. When she walked through the village carrying her jar of embers, even the dogs fell quiet. You could tell she wasn't afraid of the frost anymore. She treated it like an old adversary she'd learned to bargain with. The first of them were volunteers, ordinary families with steady hands and good memory. But before long, their task took on a sacred aura. People began bringing offerings, bread, wool, a carved spoon, tokens of gratitude for shared fire. It became a kind of social currency. You could measure a family's honor by how many embers they'd given away that winter. Myra's mother was among the most trusted of these ashkeepers. She kept a journal of heat, the first record of what we would later call the law of breath. She charted which woods burned best, how long embers lived when sealed in ash, how breathing patterns changed the color of flame. What she discovered bordered on the scientific. Fire responded to rhythm. The pattern was clear. If you blew too fast, it died. If you smothered it, it suffocated. But if you breathed steadily, in through the nose, out through the heart, it seemed to recognize you. It would bloom, sigh, and live. We began to treat flame as a partner, not a tool. Over time, the rituals deepened. The ashkeepers gathered weekly in the meeting hall to exchange embers and record their lineage. Fires were no longer personal, they were communal, all descended from the night the stranger came. People began naming their hearths. Mine was called Solvin, meaning, the stubborn one. Others chose gentler names. Whisper, Old Mother, the Watcher. To outsiders, if there had been any, it would have looked like religion. But to us, it was arithmetic. The logic of survival disguised as devotion. Each ember was a promise renewed, a breath passed along the spine of the valley. Children grew up learning the hierarchy of warmth. How to balance the household fire, how to breathe without greed, how to lend heat without losing it. Those lessons shaped our laws more than any ruler ever could. With every passing season, the ashkeepers' influence grew. They began crafting new vessels for storing embers, small clay jars lined with silver dust that glowed faintly even when sealed. These jars could hold fire for days. The keepers started trading them with nearby villages, carrying warmth across frozen rivers like merchants of survival. Our economy shifted. Gold meant nothing, ash became wealth. A single warm stone could buy grain. A jar of live embers could settle debts or end feuds. We learned to measure trust not in words but in heat shared. The keepers also codified their practices into a set of rules, our first laws that weren't born from superstition. The law of breath had 3 tenets. Fire must travel. A flame unshared is a flame that dies. Breath must guide it. The body's rhythm sustains the world's. Ash must remember. Nothing truly burns away. Everything becomes the seed of its return. We carved those words above the doorway of the meeting hall. I still see them when I close my eyes, glowing faintly in memory's light. It might sound idyllic now. This village bound together by kindness and careful breathing. But even systems born from faith have shadows. The ashkeepers became important, then essential, then powerful. The line between stewardship and authority began to blur. Soon, they were the ones deciding whose fires were renewed first when shortages struck. They kept ledgers of warmth distributed, of embers given and owed. They said it was fairness, it was bookkeeping. But fairness has a way of turning into hierarchy when measured too long. Still, for many years, it worked. The winters grew milder, or maybe we just grew wiser. The valley flourished. Children were born who had never seen frostbite. We began to forget that our miracle had come from a stranger's hand. By the time I reached adulthood, the rituals were as ordinary as breathing. No one questioned them. It was the way things had always been. That's the trick of survival. If it lasts long enough, it becomes tradition. Looking back now, I can see how fragile it all was. This balance of warmth and worship, generosity and control. Systems that save us often learn to rule us. But I didn't know that then. None of us did. We thought we had mastered the frost. We thought our faith had made us invincible. And in the quiet between one winter and the next, when the snow melted early and the river sang louder than usual, a child named Mira stood by her mother's hearth and whispered a new prayer into the embers. That whisper would change everything. I remember Mira's mother before she became a legend. Her name was Irena, though no one called her that. To us she was simply the keeper. She had the kind of face that made the wind hesitate, stern, patient, always listening for what the air might say. When she walked through the village carrying her jar of embers, even the dogs fell quiet. You could tell she wasn't afraid of the frost anymore. She treated it like an old adversary she'd learned to bargain with. Her hut stood at the far end of Valmir, where the valley began to climb toward the ridge. I used to go there as a boy, carrying bundles of wood or messages from my father. She always thanked me with a smile that looked half like pity, half like prophecy. The air inside her hut was strange, never cold, never warm, like it couldn't decide what season it belonged to. The walls shimmered faintly with soot, but the floor was spotless. Every corner glowed with the soft light of sleeping embers. It felt less like a home than a heartbeat made visible. And then there was the child. Mira was born on a night so cold the stars themselves seemed brittle. I was there, not inside, but outside the hut, waiting with others as the midwife moved in and out like a shadow. The next morning, the smoke from Irena's chimney rose in a single, perfect column. No breaks, no wavering. That was how we knew both mother and child had survived. As Mira grew, it became clear she had inherited more than her mother's calm. She could sit for hours by the hearth, watching the flame with an intensity that unnerved even the elders. When she breathed, the fire shifted in rhythm with her, like a creature obeying its keeper. People whispered that the goddess Elandra had marked her. Irena didn't deny it, but she didn't encourage it either. Every gift, she'd say, is a debt in disguise. By the time Mira was 12, she had already saved 3 lives. A boy who'd fallen through river ice, a woman whose fever threatened to steal her breath, and an old man who'd wandered into the snow during a storm. Her secret was always the same, warmth. Not from her body, but from stones she heated in her oven until they glowed faintly blue. She'd press them against a person's chest, whisper the breath pattern, and wait. It looked like magic, but I had seen enough to know it was something else. Discipline, attention, the science of care practiced so faithfully it became indistinguishable from prayer. People began to visit her hut for guidance. Some came with frostbite, others with grief. She treated both the same way. A slow inhalation, a patient exhale, a transfer of warmth that seemed to say, "You are not alone." Mira grew into womanhood like a candle growing taller without burning out. Her beauty was quiet, not the kind that dazzles, but the kind that holds. When she spoke, people leaned closer, as though her voice carried heat. Yet there was sadness in her too, a distance. She would stare out at the mountains for long stretches, her expression unreadable. "The frost is never done testing us," she told me once. "It just changes its disguise." By then, the ash keepers had become almost political, a council rather than a circle. They met in the hall weekly, recording how much warmth was distributed, debating who had taken more than they gave. Mira attended sometimes, but she seemed uncomfortable with their arguments. "You can't measure warmth like trade," she said once. "It's not ownership, it's passage." The elders nodded politely and ignored her. Then came the night of her fire. It was the longest night of the year, the one we celebrated as the turning point towards spring. The entire valley was glowing with torchlight. Children ran through the snow carrying small jars of embers, singing the old song of renewal. Mira was supposed to lead the chant at the hall, but she stayed home instead. Later, people said they saw smoke rising from her roof earlier than usual, bright and strange, the color of molten copper. I was one of the first to reach her hut. Flames licked the walls like tongues too eager to speak. The air roared. Inside, through the shifting orange, I saw Mira, barefoot, her hair unbound, her hands full of glowing stones. She was trying to save her herbs, her scrolls, her daughter. Yes, her daughter. Few knew she had one. A small child, pale as milk, hidden from gossip and reverence alike. I saw Mira lift the girl high, wrap her in a wool cloak, and run toward the door. I reached out, but the smoke drove me back. The roof gave way moments later. The sound wasn't thunder, it was closer to a sigh, like something surrendering. By the time we dragged Mira out, her arms were burned, her breath shallow. The child lived. The mother did not. The villagers gathered in silence. No one spoke, not even the priests. Someone said, "Elandra has reclaimed her servant." Another added, "Or the frost grew jealous again." We buried Mira on the ridge, where the stranger's footprints had once ended. Her body burned without smoke, the flame clean and white. It was said that even the frost bowed that day. The snow around her pyre melted into perfect circles. As for the child, she was carried away by traders who came from the south a week later. No one stopped them. Maybe we feared the goddess's will. Maybe we were simply too broken to question it. The girl's name was Liana. She was 3 years old. I remember her eyes most of all, gray, storm-colored, watching us as the traders led her away. She didn't cry. She just looked, as though memorizing the valley for later. The last I saw of her was a small hand gripping the edge of the wagon, holding tight to a clay jar that glowed faintly through the cloth. It would be years before I learned what became of her. But that night, standing beside the ashes of Myra's hut, I realized something I hadn't before. That warmth was not just a gift passed between bodies. It was an inheritance, one that demanded both memory and motion. We thought Mira had died. We were wrong. She had changed form, into story, into rumor, into the ember her daughter carried south. And the world, as it always does when something holy burns, kept breathing. I still remember the morning the traders left with Liana. The valley was gray, silent, its snow no longer white but tinged with the smoke of her mother's ashes. No one followed the wagon. The sound of its wheels over frozen soil felt like punctuation. The end of a sentence none of us had wanted to finish. Years later, when I first heard stories of the southern empire of Sethem, I realized they were speaking of her. Of course, I didn't know it then. All I knew was that warmth, our warmth, had traveled farther than any of us had dared to dream. Sethem, they said, was a world of impossible brightness. The sun there never seemed to tire. Golden temples rose from dunes like frozen waves, and streets smelled of myrrh and citrus. Water ran through carved channels to keep the heat from devouring the city, and the people wore white linen to convince the light they belonged to it. I went there once, long after, drawn by curiosity or guilt. I can't say which. When I stepped through its gates, the air itself felt alive. Heat shimmered from the stones, wrapping around me like an animal's breath. Everything glowed. The domes, the walls, even the shadows. I felt I had walked into a world that had never known winter, and part of me envied it. But Sethem had its own kind of frost. Among the servants who swept the marble halls of the palace was a young woman with gray eyes, the kind of gray that only northern storms carry. Her name was Liana. She moved quietly, efficiently, and people said strange things happened when she worked. The air grew cooler, the lamps burned steadier, the gardens bloomed longer. The queen, Seraphine of Sethem, noticed her one evening. She had dismissed her attendants and was walking barefoot through the library, her favorite habit, they said, because she liked to feel the temperature of knowledge. Liana was there, dusting the shelves. The queen watched her for a long time, then asked, "Why do you breathe like that?" Liana froze, unsure what she meant. "You breathe in rhythm," said Seraphine. "Like the tide, or like the wind before rain." Liana bowed. "It helps me listen, my queen." "Listen to what?" "The fire," she said simply. From that night onward, the queen kept her close. She had her transferred to the royal archives, where the empire's oldest scrolls slept beneath marble floors that still remembered the desert's first heat. It was there, among dust and silence, that Liana began to rediscover the fragments of her mother's world. She found scrolls written in the lost dialect of Maris, a city long swallowed by sand. They told of servant queens, women who ruled not through conquest but through equilibrium. They balanced the fire of the sun with the coolness of underground wells, teaching that power was not a force to wield but a current to maintain. The words echoed everything Liana half remembered from her childhood. The breath pattern, the warmth shared, the belief that energy was not ownership but passage. She began translating the texts, writing the words side by side in two languages, the fluid southern script and the hard northern runes she carved from memory. When she breathed on the ink to dry it, the letters shimmered faintly, as if the parchment itself remembered Valmir. The queen would sit beside her and listen as she read aloud. Sometimes they debated, more often they sat in silence, understanding that silence itself was a form of reverence. "Fire is our teacher," Liana said once. "It burns only because it must move." Under the queen's patronage, she was allowed to teach the palace servants small rituals, breathing exercises before labor, water poured in circles to bless new fires. The courtiers scoffed at first. But when tempers calmed in the council chambers and the palace gardens flourished even during drought, ridicule turned to curiosity. Soon the ritual spread beyond the palace. Fishermen hummed the rhythm while casting nets. Bakers breathed the pattern over their ovens to keep loaves from burning. Children played a game called Ash and Flame, chasing each other in spirals while chanting, "In through the nose, out through the heart." Sethem began to change in subtle ways. Public fountains were built to reflect the balance between heat and water. Architects redesigned roofs to catch breezes instead of deflecting them. Scholars wrote treatises on living thermals, blending philosophy with engineering. The people called it the era of shared light. The priests, of course, were uneasy. Religion prefers obedience to balance. They watched as their sacred hierarchies softened under the warmth of a servant's wisdom. To them, Liana's influence was dangerous, not because it threatened faith, but because it democratized it. I heard of her fame through travelers. They described her as neither saint nor sorcerer, but something rarer, calm. She carried herself like a flame that refused to devour. The queen's shadow, they called her, for wherever Seraphine walked, Liana followed, her presence tempering the sunlight like a cloud's mercy. I saw her once, years later, when I returned to Sethem on trade. She was standing in the central court, surrounded by acolytes, teaching the breath law. Her hair had turned silver early, not from age, but from heat and memory. She looked older than her years, and yet unbroken. When she exhaled, I swear the air itself cooled. People say the queen and the servant grew inseparable, their friendship becoming a subject of endless speculation. But I think it was simpler than that. They recognized each other across the gulf of class and climate. Two women, both custodians of warmth in different forms. One born of frost, one born of fire. Each seeing in the other the missing half of equilibrium. Sethem prospered under them. Crops multiplied, disputes waned, trade thrived. The empire credited its golden age to divine favor, but I knew better. It was the same miracle that had once visited Valmir. The discipline of balance disguised as grace. I sometimes wonder if Liana ever thought of the north, the hut, the fire, her mother's voice whispering to the flame. Maybe she dreamed of snow the way we once dreamed of sunlight, as something impossible, almost sacred. She had carried our warmth across worlds, turned survival into philosophy, and given it new language. But even then, I sensed that balance cannot live long in palaces. The air there grows too still. And somewhere in that stillness, the frost was already learning how to return. It always begins quietly, the unraveling. No thunder, no sudden flame. Just a shift in the air, too subtle to name. For Liana, it began the day the queen smiled differently. I was in Setham then, older, a wanderer making maps for merchants who believed roots could tame the desert. I saw her once across the courtyard. The queen radiant in white silk, Liana beside her in plain linen. Yet something in the way Seraphine looked at her had changed, an affection heavy enough to draw envy like moths to a lamp. Rumor, like fire, spreads fastest through dry hearts. The courtiers began to whisper, "The servant has bewitched her." The priests of the solar temple, already uneasy with Liana's teachings, seized their moment. They accused her of reviving the heresy of Maris, the ancient order of women who once claimed that power belonged to balance, not blood. Their words were calculated to sting. "She teaches equality between servant and ruler," they cried in the streets. "She confuses warmth with worship." The queen defended her at first. Seraphine was no coward. She spoke of harmony and the sacred duty of breath. "Is not the sun itself both giver and destroyer?" she told the council. "Then why should its lesson be feared? But fear, once seated, grows like ivy." The priests began performing public exorcisms of northern frost, waving torches over the marketplaces, warning that the old goddess Elandra was creeping south to extinguish the sun. They called Liana a vessel of cold. Some swore the queen's shadow had grown longer, darker, as if her soul were dimming. And then, one evening, the king returned. He had been at war for years, an arrogant man, known more for victories than wisdom. When he saw Liana, he fell silent, as if struck by recognition. Within months, he made her his queen. The court went still. It should have been a triumph, the final joining of fire and frost, servant and sovereign. But power cannot marry innocence without consequence. The king's declaration undid everything. In one gesture, he turned harmony into threat. The queen was humiliated, the priests were outraged. Liana bore it with stillness that unsettled everyone. "I did not seek a throne," she said. "I only breathed where I am." But her calm became her accusation. To the powerful, serenity looks like mockery. The temple bells tolled for 7 nights. On the 8th, the council convened. I was there, pressed among the crowd at the back of the great hall, watching as the priests surrounded her like wolves that had rehearsed the hunt. Liana of Valmir, the high priest intoned, "You stand accused of heresy and deceit, of stealing the queen's favor, of poisoning the king's soul, of teaching forbidden rites that bind heat and cold against the will of the sun." She didn't flinch. "You mistake balance for rebellion," she said softly. "Then you confess to spreading the doctrine of Maris?" "I confess to breathing," she replied. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone laughed, someone else cried. The priests pressed on. They accused her of resurrecting the cult of the dead queens of Maris, of mixing ashes with incense, of using human remains to feed her lamps. Lies, all of it, but believable because they fed the oldest fear, that warmth might come from somewhere unclean. When they demanded she renounce her teachings, she only bowed her head and whispered, "Fire does not ask who it warms." That single sentence sealed her fate. The king rose to defend her, but his voice faltered. Power has its own gravity, it pulls even love downward. By nightfall, the council had declared her guilty. The crowd cheered, not from faith, but from relief. The relief of having found a scapegoat for balance they could not understand. They stripped her crown. The high priest cut the silver clasp from her hair, letting it fall in dull gray waves. Her hands remained still, folded as if in prayer. At dawn, soldiers led her through the palace gates toward the desert's edge. The queen watched from her balcony, barefoot as always, her face unreadable. The road beyond the city was nothing but gold dust and wind. I followed from a distance, unseen. The soldiers stopped where the dunes began. One gestured for her to continue alone. She did. She walked barefoot into the sand, carrying nothing but a clay jar, half sand, half ash. The wind rose around her, lifting her hair like a halo. She paused once, turned toward the city, and though her lips didn't move, I swear I heard her voice as clearly as if she stood beside me. Balance cannot be burned. Then she walked on, and the desert closed behind her. That night, the palace filled with smoke. The king's chambers caught fire, burning from within. When they broke open the doors, the walls were scorched black, but the air smelled not of death, but myrrh. The king was gone. Only a faint outline of his body remained in the soot, hands folded as if in surrender. The priests declared divine judgment. The queen vanished soon after. Some said she followed Liana into the desert. Others whispered she burned herself to join her. The empire mourned them both in silence, rewriting the story as tragedy instead of revelation. The breath law was banned. The chant outlawed. Anyone caught speaking the words in through the nose, out through the heart was branded a heretic. The scrolls were gathered and burned. Their ashes rose into the night like hundreds of small, glowing souls. But warmth, once shared, never truly dies. Servants kept the rhythm alive in whispers and lullabies. Mothers hummed it while nursing children. Builders carved its symbols beneath floor tiles. Even the palace guards, who'd once carried torches in the purges, found themselves breathing the pattern unconsciously on cold nights. Years passed, then centuries. Sethem's temples crumbled. Its scholars died. Its name faded from maps. But sometimes, in distant towns, travelers spoke of a figure glimpsed at dusk on the desert's edge. A woman walking barefoot through heat that refused to touch her, carrying a jar that glowed faintly from within. They said the sand never cooled where she stepped. I never saw her again. But I can still feel her voice in the air, a quiet equilibrium that refuses extinction. Liana had not been defeated. She had dispersed, into legend, into breath, into every act of warmth that defies the coldness of power, centuries past. The empire of Sethem collapsed under its own brilliance, its golden roof swallowed by sand. Valmir, too, disappeared, its valley filled with ice and time. The world turned, civilizations traded names, gods, and justifications, but the rhythm endured, hiding in plain sight. When I was old, I heard that warmth had become a science. The scholars of later ages gave it new language: thermodynamics, combustion, energy transfer. They wrote equations where we once wrote prayers. And yet, whenever I read their texts, I recognized the same logic, the law of breath disguised in symbols and numbers. Fire must move. Heat must be shared. Nothing is lost, only change. They had rediscovered our faith without knowing it. Then came the news that made me smile even in my final years: a discovery in the desert. It was 2023, though time had long ceased to mean much to me. Archaeologists, digging in northern Egypt, uncovered fragments of scrolls sealed inside a clay jar. They called it an anomaly, a cross-cultural artifact containing two languages, one northern, one desert-born. One side written in runes that no known culture used, the other in the flowing script of Sethem. At first, they assumed it a forgery. But as the researchers cleaned the fragments and ran their instruments over the faded ink, strange things began to happen. The parchment emitted a faint heat, measurable, inexplicable. When photographed under infrared, the letters glowed faintly blue, the same impossible hue that once danced in our fires. Among the fragments was a phrase repeated several times: in through the nose, out through the heart. It puzzled the scientists. Some thought it a meditation technique, others dismissed it as poetic nonsense. Only one, a linguist named Farah Dalen, noticed that the handwriting on the Sethem side matched a record from the royal archives, an archived letter attributed to the lost queen's scribe. Under magnification, she saw another layer of faint text beneath the ink, pressed into the fibers as if written with a dry stylus. She read the name aloud, barely believing it. Liana of Valmir. For days, the team worked in feverish quiet. They found more fragments buried nearby, bits of pottery with northern markings, traces of blue dust embedded in the seams. They tested it for minerals, expecting iron or cobalt. Instead, the instruments reported phosphorescence without decay. Residual luminescence, they called it, though none could explain why it pulsed like a heartbeat. The media, predictably, turned it into spectacle. "The Lost Queen's Fire," screamed one headline. "Evidence of a prehistoric energy cult," said another. Television hosts debated whether Liana was scientist or sorceress, goddess or fraud. None understood she was simply human. Someone who had once learned how to keep warmth alive without hoarding it. In a museum in Cairo, they placed the fragments on display under glass. I've seen the photographs: pale parchment, dark edges, faint blue traces where her hand once moved. And there, still legible beneath centuries of dust and translation, the same words that ended her trial. "Fire does not ask who it warms." Visitors stare at that line without really reading it. Some take selfies beside the case, some move on to shinier relics. But a few linger. They tilt their heads, as if the air around the display has changed temperature. Maybe it has. Maybe the ink still breathes. Because here is what the curators never say. The climate-controlled vault where they keep those scrolls hums faintly warmer than the rooms beside it. Instruments record the anomaly, but the staff laugh it off. Residual energy, they say, heat trapped in the parchment. They don't realize they've recreated her ritual, sealing warmth in ash, keeping the breath alive. Sometimes I wonder how much of her survived, how much of all of us. In hospitals, yoga studios, therapy rooms, soldiers' barracks, you can hear the same chant, stripped of origin, softened into instruction. Breathe in through the nose. Exhale through the heart. No one knows it was once a prayer against extinction. And still, the rhythm returns whenever the world grows cold. During blackouts, pandemics, wars, humans gather again around small lights, screens, candles, campfires. They share breath without noticing. They rediscover what Valmir knew, what Setham forgot, what Liana lived. That warmth must move or it dies. I have walked through modern cities at night, streets shimmering with electric fire, apartment windows glowing like tiny hearths stacked to the sky. Every window a story. Every bulb a promise that the dark can be managed if we share enough current. Yet even in that abundance, the old imbalance hums beneath. Who controls the flame, who freezes? It comforts me, though, to think her lesson lingers not in temples but in gestures. In a mother's hand adjusting a blanket over a child. In a stranger holding a door during a storm. In power grids built from cooperation rather than conquest. These are the new ash keepers, though they don't know the name. And still, sometimes, warmth becomes arrogance again. Nations burning brighter than they need, leaving others to freeze. That's when the frost returns, not from sky or soil, but from the spaces between people. Liana's story isn't ancient, it's cyclical. Every age rediscovers her truth the hard way. The scientists say the world is warming now, dangerously so. They call it crisis, and they're right. But part of me smiles at the irony. We have mastered heat and yet forgotten harmony. We've learned how to summon fire, but not how to listen to it. In lectures and documentaries, I hear her name mentioned in passing, Liana of Valmir, an early thinker of proto-ecological philosophy. They speak of her like an abstraction, a curiosity. None of them see the person I saw. A woman walking barefoot through dust that glowed with memory. Strange, isn't it? How stories of fire and frost echo through time, from huts to laboratories, from embers to data, from breath to equation. Every civilization, no matter its language, survives on borrowed warmth. And when it forgets to share it, the frost finds a way back in. So here we are, traveler. At the edge of the firelight again. You've followed me through frost and empire, through ash and gold, through the long breath of centuries. Perhaps your room is quiet now, The kind of quiet that feels like snow about to fall. Maybe the hum of your device is the only sound left, your modern hearth glowing faintly in the dark. Look at it. That light, the one reflecting on your hands, is older than electricity. It's the same hunger, reshaped. The same instinct that made Mira press a glowing stone to her child's chest. The same heat that filled a desert library with breath and balance. The same fragile gift that built Valmir, Setham, and every city that came after. Fire was never ours to command. It only ever asked for care. I sometimes imagine Liana standing here with us, watching how her secret has changed form. The glass of your screen, the circuitry behind it, all of it burning in miniature, controlled and continuous. She'd understand it instantly. She'd see the pattern. The ember now multiplied, carried across continents not in clay jars but in wires. And she'd ask, as she always did, the only question that mattered, are we still sharing it? That question lingers in me more than any history I've studied. It hums beneath the noise of our inventions, beneath the flicker of street lamps and the pulse of engines. Because the truth she left us was never about worship or law, it was about motion. Warmth, power, kindness, whatever you name it, survives only when it moves. I've seen the frost return in many forms. In greed, in silence, in the quiet cruelty of comfort hoarded. Every age believes it has outgrown the cold. Every age forgets. And yet, always, there are ashkeepers, those who refuse to let the fire go out. They don't wear titles. They're nurses on night shifts, engineers repairing the grid, teachers lighting curiosity in tired eyes. They breathe the same rhythm. In through the nose, out through the heart. Maybe you're one of them. If you've stayed this long, if you've carried this story through the dark to this moment, then you already know how it ends. It doesn't. The breath continues. The warmth passes on. Every listener becomes a keeper. Sometimes I imagine a future archaeologist unearthing what we've left behind, not scrolls, but circuits and glass. Maybe they'll find this recording, or a trace of our heat in the ruins of our machines. They'll study it and wonder, as we did, whether we understood the gift we carried. Whether we tended it wisely. Whether we remembered to breathe. And I hope they'll find one sentence, carved somewhere, still legible. Fire does not ask who it warms. Those 7 words are everything: scripture, science, warning, and mercy all at once. They remind us that warmth was never a privilege, it was a covenant. The line between queen and servant, between master and beggar, between north and south, was always an illusion. The only real border is between those who share their fire and those who let it die. So as your screen begins to dim, and the quiet grows thick around you, listen for her one last time. The servant of frost, the queen of flame, the keeper of breath, she's still walking somewhere, barefoot through the dunes, the jar in her hands glowing with the light of 1,000 hearts. The sand doesn't cool where she steps. The air hums softly, like a heartbeat stretched across centuries. She doesn't look back, she doesn't need to. Because she knows you're here now, tending the ember in your own way, through words, through work, through the simple act of staying kind in a world that keeps forgetting how. So take one final breath with me. In through the nose, out through the heart, let it travel farther than you can see. The frost will come again someday. It always does, but so will the fire. And when it does, I hope someone, maybe you, maybe a stranger listening years from now, will remember this story, this rhythm, this small and stubborn truth that has carried us from the first hut to the last city. That warmth, shared, is the only immortality we ever had. Keep the lights low, keep the breath steady, keep the ember alive. Our story is finished, but the fire goes on.